Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back. What I'd like for you at the end of listening to this to be able to do is I'm hoping that you'll be able to understand how it is that these communities that are prone to violence within the Caribbean context develop. What is the nature of the violence that may occur within these communities? And then I'd want you to be able to discuss and a major effect of this type of community violence, and the one that I'm going to be highlighting to you all is the effect of community violence on children. So community violence is a complex term, and it's been used to refer to a wide range of events, riots, sniper attacks, gang wars, drive-by shootings, workplace assaults, terrorist attacks, torture, bombings, wars, ethnic cleansing, physical and sexual abuse, as well as emotional abuse. So you get the picture. It's really any type of violence that occurs within the community context. Mental health professionals often make a distinction between studies on crime-related events in which adults are often the focus, and studies on exposure to violence in which children and adolescents are the focus. Things like school shootings, witnessing of murders, living in war zones. Another distinction that's often made is between domestic violence, referring to abuse between two adults involved in a romantic relationship, and child sexual or physical abuse, referring to violence between a child and an adult. And now there's a third distinction that's made also between predatory violence, in which an individual, usually a stranger, tries to take something of value using physical threats or direct violence. Distinction between that and interpersonal conflicts, in which two acquaintances are involved in a violent altercation with the intent to harm each other. And both types of violence may include brutal acts such as shooting, rape, stabbings, and beatings. So one definition that's of community violence that's been used to encompass all of these different types of violence is the frequent and continual use of guns, knives, and drugs, and random violence in the community. Now, violence can be classified in a variety of ways. Collective violence, well, it's useful to differentiate between collective violence, in which there's more than one person engaging in violence, from individual violence. These two types of violence frequently have different motivations and dynamics. Then we have mob violence. One form of collective violence is mob violence. And this is very different from individual violence, and frequently involves issues relating to social justice. So such violence often spontaneously erupts from an initiating incident that causes a group to become angry from some kind of common insult, with the result being that violence breaks out and it spreads. Um, there are many different examples of that type of violence. Jamaica has had various incidents in the past. In 1999 was probably our largest with the gas riots. Of course, we're all aware of what's taking place in the United States at the moment. There are examples there as well. We also have collective systemized violence. It's useful to differentiate between collective systematized violence from randomly occurring mob violence. An example of collective systematized violence is overt war, right? Systematized violence also it can be more subtle and covert as well. So, for example, that type of violence that is woven within the fabric of the social order. So, institutionalized racism, for example, sexism, these can be interpreted as types of covert violence as well. We have hate crime violence. Hate crime violence is another type of violence that can be a form of either collective or individual violence. the nature and the type of that violence is different from random violence. So mob violence, for example, um, is different from this type of violence because mob violence is frequently the product of malice, and an extreme form of hate crime violence is terrorism. Terrorism is perpetrated by a fringe individual or small group trying to convince a society that there are scores of people who legitimately hate the victimized group. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about individual violence now. That includes things like mass murders, serial murder. There are several different types of individual violence that occur in different circumstances, um, from the types of collective violence that we've previously discussed. Multicide is a type of individual violence in which three or more people are killed. Mass murder occurs when three or more people are being killed simultaneously. And a murder spree occurs when three or more people are killed as a part of a spree. Finally, serial murder occurs when three or more people are killed over an extended period. These types of violent behavior are perpetrated by individuals who are often psychotic or psychopathic. Predatory violence is another form of individual violence, also known as secondary violence or instrumental violence. Predatory violence often occurs between strangers with a perpetrator and a victim clearly defined from the outset. So the goal of harming the victim is secondary to the goal of obtaining something of value from the victim. Example, in a robbery. Predatory violence is an instrument or a means to an end, but it's not the end itself. And then finally, interpersonal altercation violence. Uh, this is the final type of individual violence that we'll discuss. It's frequently the most common form of violence, also known as primary or expressive violence. Interpersonal altercation violence, it usually occurs as a result of a conflict with an acquaintance, a friend, or a family member. The perpetrator and the victim are not necessarily clearly defined at the outset of the interaction. In interpersonal altercation violence, the intent is the primary objective is to harm the other person. So these forms of violence are often known as, sometimes referred to as crimes of passion. A subtype of interpersonal altercation violence is domestic violence. This subtype is also inclusive of things like spousal abuse, child abuse, and elder abuse. Another form of violence is drug-related violence. Which can be divided into a number of different categories. Systemic drug-related violence, for example, occurs when drug dealers kill other drug dealers in order to have a larger market share in which to sell drugs. So, fighting for turf. Economic drug-related violence occurs when a drug user needs more money to buy drugs and engages in predatory violence in order to get that drug money. And then the last type of violence we'll discuss is gang-related violence, and something that we are, of course, we are very familiar with in the Caribbean. Gang-related violence is another type of violence, and it is frequently collective systemic, it's a collective systemic type of violence. It may also occur because of an interpersonal altercation, or because of or for predatory motives. Most gang homicides are not random. The vast majority involve um, gang members fighting over things like turf, status, or revenge. Okay, so now that we've gotten the typologies out of the way, let's dig a little bit into um, what I really want you to understand from the lecture. The first point, which is to understand what communities are prone to this type of violence. And so, I'm going to give you a bit of a history lesson, using Jamaica as an example. Hopefully you'll be able to stay with me. But it's at the end of it, you should be able to get a really good understanding as to how these types of communities have developed within the Caribbean context, as I said, using Jamaica as an example. But let me talk a bit first about social polarization generally. Within the last 3 or 4 decades, there's been a renewed interest in the manner in which economic and social forces lead to spatial concentrations of wealth and poverty. In some cases, the link between these divisions and crime is made explicit. In other concepts that have emerged in urban theories, writers have focused on the forces of segmentation and economic exclusion that lay the groundwork for conflict in urban areas. So some have referred to this process of increased spatial concentrations of wealth and poverty as social polarization. So you may be wondering why I have these two shapes on the screen. When distributed normally, the population of a city looks like an egg. So that is, it's widest in the middle and tapering off towards both ends. With social polarization, the rich get richer and the middle is squeezed downwards. So that leads to an hourglass distribution. So therefore, social polarization is defined as a change in certain social distributions such that there is a shift away from a statistically normal or egg-shaped distribution where the bottom and top ends are growing relatively and possibly absolutely at the expense of the middle. So there is therefore what you would call a new class alignment in global cities, a new polarization. Now, this is a process which is argued to have occurred and to be occurring all over the world. One of the pioneers on the subject of social polarization was a scholar by the name of Saskia Sassen. Now, he argued that polarization developed in a number of stages. It begins with a shift from manufacturing to services. Secondly, there's a growth in low-grade service industries with a concentration in the personal service sector, providing services for the wealthy. Persons in these industries work for very low wages, and their conditions of employment are insecure. Many of these jobs are filled by immigrants rather than those who have been made redundant by the manufacturing sector. And so, therefore, unemployment increases. Those jobs are not absorbing those that have lost their jobs from the manufacturing sector. And then finally, there's a growth of informalization in what remains of the now downgraded manufacturing sector. So economic restructuring leads to an expansion in the supply of low paying jobs and a shrinking supply of middle income jobs. And so therefore a polarized income structure. And these economic forces lead not only to the hourglass type of society that I was describing earlier, but also to spatial segmentation, with the poor left stranded in dilapidated neighborhoods in the vicinity of the now defunct manufacturing industries. Now, Saskin's critics point out that social polarization in different countries may have different causes, right? In some instances, it may result from economic restructuring, leading to changes in the labor market structure of occupations and income in the paid labor market, like I was discussing. Other forces sometimes exist, however, such as changes in the age structure of a population and changes in household composition. Yet others disagreed with this whole notion of a polarized city or a dual city in the first place. Mark Hughes, for example, put forward the notion of a quartered city made up of the elite, the suburbanites, those in what he called tenements, and then those in the derelict, abandoned cities. So his criticism was that no, it's not a dual city. It is a city in quadrants. So, so the question now is, what's the relevance of all of this for the Caribbean? And as I said, I'm going to use uh, Kingston in particular, Jamaica, as a case study. Now, the spatial patterning that has been captured in in debates relating to social polarization and the dual city has been a feature of the global process which has affected colonial port cities of Asia and Africa in the 18th and the 19th centuries. This is not the pattern that emerged in Kingston, Jamaica. Kingston was founded on the institution of slavery, and where spatial segregation would have been in opposition to laws which discouraged the congregation of slaves. So slaves and free, rich and poor lived side by side. And it was from this situation that the yard, or the modern day low income solution to the urban housing problem, it emerged. In the early 19th century, an English resident in Kingston described what he saw as a wretched intermixture of handsome spacious houses with vile hovels and disgraceful sheds. So rich and poor living side by side, cheek by jowl. Now, this spatial heterogeneity it didn't develop by chance. It was a direct response to the social relations in a slave society. In the middle of the 18th century, there were between 15,000 and 16,000 slaves in Kingston. In a society that rested on slavery, slaves were, as you can imagine, deeply functional. They were needed as domestics in the 700 white households, um, but a far larger number was employed along the wharfs, and there were artisans who were hired out by their masters, the so-called jobbing slaves. Now, housing these slaves in an urban setting was not easy, as it was a well, I should say it was not as easy as it was on large rural plantations, as you can imagine. So domestic slaves were housed in quarters at the back of proprietors' residences, and they opened out into lanes in the city. So there was a residential arrangement of white residences having this like a broad street frontage, um, and slave quarters and activity sharing space with poorer white businesses in the narrow lanes behind. Now, alternative accommodation had to be found for the larger group of non-domestic slaves, and the Negro yard was the solution to the problem of shelter for urban slaves. The slaves were allowed to erect huts on empty lots in any area of the city in the west, in the more wealthy east, and in the hub of commercial activity around the waterfront. Now, residential sorting began in the early. Now, there was overcrowding in the tenement yards in West Kingston, accompanied by conditions described as the worst example of slum life in the island. Poor, densely populated settlements developed around the wharves and the processing zone that was developing to the extreme south of the city. In some respects, the modern yards appear to serve the same function as the 18th and 19th century Negro yards. The ones receiving the recent rural migrant to the city, and the other, um, the now the impoverished freed slave. In the early 20th century, the Salvation Army established something called penny lodgings. This was to accommodate rural vendors and migrants who came into Kingston to sell their produce or their labor. These lodgings could not meet the need for accommodation, and they sought shelter in the west, areas which were along the main road, Spanish Town, and the Constant Spring roads leading to Kingston. And some of the areas of the denser settlement were in close proximity to the markets. Now, some uptown low-income areas such as Grants Pen, Cassava Peace along Constant Spring Road grew up by this process, and the settlements along Spanish Town Road were the antecedents of some of the most depressed inner city communities today. So the inner cities of the USA grew by the influx of poor immigrants, while those of Kingston grew by internal migration, as well as by high levels of natural increase. Some suburban development occurred in the second half of the 20th century. So when housing schemes were developed on the Ligony Plain in St. Andrew for the lower and middle class, they're talking about Havendale, Meadowbrook, Mona Heights, and individual housing in what was now to become the upscale Barbican, Constant Spring, and Beverly Hills. Some of the upmarket individual developments surrounded and enclosed the villages, such as Barbican Village. That's how these uptown pockets of low income communities developed within Kingston. There, the middle and upper class areas grew to surround them. So the yards that had developed on the Ligony Plain in association with sugar plantations and swelled by they began to swell by rural migration. Very high densities and poor living conditions developed within these uptown low income areas. But this population, although occupying a different space, they were particularly well placed to provide a service. They serviced the families of the surrounding middle and upper income areas as things like um, household gardeners and helpers. So I'm hoping that that would have given you a good indication of how it is that these types of communities develop. Now we're going to speak a bit about why it is that these communities are prone to violence. And this is where a lot of your application of the theories that we discussed earlier in the course, theories of deviance, should come into play. Now, a number of theories have been put forward to explain crime or deviance. As I said, this is where your knowledge of those types of deviance theories will come into play that you've learned to this point. But I'm going to put forward one that is particularly relevant to a lot of my own work, and that is that of social exclusion. Now, in a speech to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation in 2006, the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, he pointed to what he saw as the deeply intractable aspects of social exclusion. He argued that the problems of the socially excluded are numerous and they're deeply embedded in 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 society and often passed down from generation to generation. And so he felt that as a result, the most socially excluded are particularly hard to reach. They may lack access to communication networks that are an important aspect of modern life. They may lack access to financial services, which may exclude them from advantages of borrowing and buying on credit. And they may be deprived of taking an active part in political organizations. That's of course an essential element in an effective democracy and something that we often overlook when we think of mechanisms of exclusion. The socially excluded are also um, the disabled or older persons who are excluded from the benefits of or from making an active contribution to their communities. They may the social excluded may be involved in criminal activity, but they also suffer disproportionately from the threat of being victims of crime. The highest levels of criminal activity are experienced by those living in deprived areas. So there's no doubt that much of the violent crime that um, occurs in societies is committed by poor marginal groups. You have young unemployed men generally cast adrift. They mobilize one of their few resources, which is physical strength, and they may form gangs, and they create a world that revolves around masculine power and respect. So of course, if they're excluded, what they do is they they create divisions among themselves, and they too exclude others, often by very aggressive means. Now, the dialectics of exclusion is a process that it accentuates marginality, and it's a process that involves not only the wider society, but it's important to remember that it involves the excluded themselves as well. Now, there's abundant research showing that these marginalized communities are more likely to suffer from violence than the more advantaged communities. the slums of Colombian, Mexican, Brazilian cities report some of the highest homicide rates in those countries. The violence emerges in this context because it plays a specific role. In the absence of legitimate means of survival, you have young men who are resorting to violence as a means of economic gain. They become involved in illicit activities, and before long, they need often revolving around drugs. They need to defend their territory in order to conduct these activities, and this inevitably leads to violence. Young men often resort to violence in order to assert their authority, gain respect, gain social recognition. They don't have any faith in the police or in the state's ability or will to protect them, and so they use violence to protect themselves from rival gangs. There's a lack of confidence in the state apparatus, and this might cause these communities to themselves take matters of law into their own hands and set up an alternative justice system that may hand down brutal sentences. Very common in Jamaica. Uh, and some of other Caribbean islands as well. Now, for all of these reasons, violence is very pervasive in communities that are excluded. So, what's the nature of this violence? There's often a long history of violence in these communities, interpersonal, intergroup, as well as conflict with neighboring communities as well. Now, now these communities are scenes of much internal conflict. Most inner city communities in Jamaica are extremely fractured internally, with the tribal divisions of the community clearly and rigidly defined. Each of these spatial tracts is controlled by a specific gang comprising of young men who are held together by strong bonds. So conflict within and among these groups is the source of much of the violence that we see taking place. Residents in these communities have a strong commitment to identify with specific groupings, and this results in the existence of an extremely segmented and polarized community. You have internal rivalry and discord, and rituals associated with initiation, rites of passage, as well as intergroup conflict, and these all find violent expression. So now, a study I did in 2004 in one inner city community in Kingston involved discussions with community members, and participants tried to explain the reason for the level of interpersonal violence, and they frequently made a reference to a history, a history of violent confrontation among groups in what was a very geographically fragmented community. And the impression that was given was that there was almost a tradition that had to be respected, and that the length of the conflict added depth and intensity. Now, Anthony Harriot explained this type of reasoning in terms of focalization. And this is where small incidents are taken out of conflict and are aggregated. Now, new incidents are then now interpreted in light of the prior history of conflicts, and therefore they generate a greater emotional intensity than if they were treated in their own merit. Focalization is something, it's not unique to community violence. It happens in personal relationships as well. Your significant other, you start to, if you're arguing, you start to interpret arguments as a function of those arguments that occurred before, and you get more angry as a result of those previous arguments than if this one argument was just taken at its own merit. So the other reason that Harriet gave for the intensification of conflicts was something called transvaluation. So you have focalization and transvaluation, in which personal issues are masked and then redefined in terms of a broader community or maybe political party interests. So, for example, if a member of a gang was disrespected by someone, he then translates that problem into a broader community issue. Okay, if you diss me, it mean you diss the entire community, for example. And what that does is that it necessitates some kind of group response rather than an individual response, and certainly rather than letting it go. Now, the result of this is a high degree of gun violence, poor on poor, marginalized on marginalized, and sadly, it seemed as if they had seen so much wanton loss of life that they placed little value on human life. And so the young men in the focus group, these are quotes here from children, sorry, from young adults that were interviewed um, by me. So violence is used to get um, things like fame, stripes in the bad man world. Okay, so we've gone through the development of the types of low income communities within the Jamaican context that lead to community violence. We've spoken about how it is that um, violence erupts within these type of communities, and we've spoken about the nature of violence that occurs. The last thing I want to discuss with you all is one effect of um, community violence. Now, there are several different types of effects of community violence, and I have a number of them up on the screen. But we're going to focus on one of the most troubling effects, and that is the effect on children. Now, the frequent and continual exposure of children to community violence, that's an issue of increasing concern internationally. It's a less serious problem in the United Kingdom than the United States, where, of course, in the United States of America, homicides are among the leading causes of death among children and adolescents. Now, research in the Caribbean, research in Jamaica indicates that exposure is common, and children living in deprived urban communities are at greatest risk of both victimization and violence. Again, if you look at the United States, in one study that looked at children aged 12 to 17, found that more than one third of girls and almost a half of the boys reported witnessing at least one act of violence in their community during their lifetime. There are also reports, studies done, numerous studies done showing high levels of exposure of children in Latin America and the Caribbean. In Jamaica, it is particularly grave. Um, One study highlighted that the high level of violence to which Jamaican children are exposed through they were doing an assessment of over 1,500 urban 11 to 12-year-olds, and they reported that a third of the children surveyed had witnessed severe acts of physical violence, while a fifth had been victims of violence themselves, with boys and children attending primary school who had the greatest level of exposure. If you're wondering why primary school is relevant within Jamaica, um, primary schools are a very good proxy, or I should say, attendance in at primary schools is a very good proxy for level of income. So what's particularly troubling in these communities is that these are families that are virtually trapped in spatially restricted, um, toxic enclaves. They basically lost faith um, in the ability and the will of the state system of justice to address their problems, and where parents don't possess the skills to buffer the effects. Now, moreover, street violence is not the only type of violence that is witnessed by communities, by children in inner city communities. They witness domestic violence. They may witness accidental deaths. and indeed they witness acts of extreme barbarity. Now, research has detailed a variety of responses to acute and chronic violence: learning disabilities, aggression, despair, post traumatic shock syndrome. These are all methods of coping with and adapting to exposure, of navigating what are painful experiences. Some of the strategies are seen as adaptive, but some environments may be too much for anyone. And under those conditions of chronic stress, few children can be expected to escape unscathed. Research has shown that children who witness or who are themselves victims of violence, they may display a number of social or psychological problems. So among urban black children, exposure to violence is seen as one of the strongest predictors of the use of violence in the future and delinquent behavior. Children are forced to develop defensive responses which are manifested in the carrying of weapons or in constant fighting. Those who are exposed to violence begin to believe that the nature of their environment is so threatening that they have no choice but to react violently or even to carry a weapon. So gun possession among the young is strongly linked to a self-reported need for protection. The repeated witnessing of violent acts can also affect the learned behavior of a child, as violence is seen and based on this becomes an acceptable response to conflict. So self-restraint may be affected by affected as inhibitions are weakened. Um, and so you may the propensity to carry out aggressive acts is increased. It makes the use of violence normal. It makes use of violence an accepted method of achieving um, instrumental or relational goals. Exposure has been associated with a variety of emotional responses as well: depression, grief, anxiety, sleep disturbances. All of these have been associated with exposure to community violence. The diagnosis of post traumatic stress disorder. Of course, as we know, it's made when trauma results in a combination of all of these symptoms, which persist for over a month. And a number of studies document a link between both acute and chronic exposure to violence and PTSD. And there is a gender differential that has been reported as well, with girls more likely to show the symptoms indicative of PTSD, while boys' exposure is more likely to be linked with acting out problem behaviors such as delinquency. Now, the truth is that many children escape the effects of this, and that might be the result of different responses to the threats or to the employment of different coping strategies. So repeated exposure to violence, it can result in a form of what we call a cognitive distortion, and that allows children to normalize or to ignore or to accept violence or to develop pathological adaptations to the form of desensitization in the form of desensitization to violence or an identification with aggressors. When we say an identification with aggressors, we mean um, forcing yourself to understand why it is these perpetrators may be doing what they're doing. Now, desensitization is one of the key effects of exposure to chronic violence. It refers to sort of an elimination of cognitive, emotional, and behavioral responses to stimulus. So cognitive desensitization is it's apparent when there's a shift in the belief that violence is uncommon to an acceptance of violence as inevitable. So of course, if it is inevitable, then it creates a less of anxiety, and that inhibits aggression. So in addition to the emotional response to violence, in addition to the cognitive response to violence, I should say there is an emotional response as often as well. And so there's a numbing or a lack of empathy associated with emotional desensitization. All of the skills that regulate emotions are compromised, and so it increases the risk of aggressive behavior. Normalizing violence can mitigate the effects of exposure and at the same time increase the risk of violent behavior. So that's a process which could perpetuate the process of what we call psychological adaptation. Now, there can successful coping if children are able to process the traumatic experiences and develop a framework that allows them to give meaning to the events. Three techniques have been highlighted that children may use. Firstly, they may engage in a reconstrual of the situation or their role in the situation in such a way, for example, as to place themselves on the right side of the conflict. So, as a coping mechanism, children have been found to convince themselves that their community is on the right side of the conflict. Secondly, they could employ distraction or positive imagery, things like music, art, sports, TV shows, music videos, video games. These are all examples of behavioral distractions that may help children to dampen the fear that arises from a life in a violent community. And then finally, they translate their long-term goals, for example, escaping the inner city, into realistic short-term goals. And what that does is that it not only increases the likelihood that those goals would be achieved, but it builds their sense of mastery and self-efficacy as they do in fact achieve those short-term goals. Okay, so thanks for staying with me. As I said, the aim of this lecture was to allow you to be able to understand um, uh, what it is that leads to, well, first and foremost, what community violence is, um, how it is that communities that are prone to community violence occur within the Caribbean context, what is the nature of that type of violence, and then finally, what is one main effect of community violence? And I chose to focus on exposure of children to that violence, but there are many different types of effects, of course, of community violence that you yourself may want to explore. Okay.